Breaking from the earliest pages of biblical history, a brief and unsettling passage has continued to provoke debate for thousands of years. In the book of Genesis, a mysterious statement appears almost without warning, claiming that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, described as mighty men of renown. This short reference has generated one of the most controversial discussions in religious and historical studies, because it suggests that beings of unusual nature and power existed long before modern civilization. Unlike poetic metaphors or extended parables, the text presents the claim as a matter of record, offering no detailed explanation yet leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions that scholars still struggle to resolve. The timing of the Nephilim's appearance is especially significant. According to the biblical narrative, their presence coincides with a period of widespread moral decline. Violence, corruption, and disobedience are described as spreading across the earth, creating an atmosphere of chaos and instability. In this context, the Nephilim are not introduced as heroes or protectors, but as figures connected to a world that is rapidly falling apart. This association has led many researchers to argue that the giants were not merely physical anomalies, but symbols, or agents, of a deeper breakdown in the order of creation itself. Central to the controversy is the phrase, sons of God, marrying the daughters of men. This wording has been interpreted in dramatically different ways across centuries. One school of thought, rooted in ancient Jewish writings and early Christian commentary, suggests that the sons of God were fallen angels who abandoned their assigned place, crossed a forbidden boundary, and produced offspring with human women. Under this interpretation, the Nephilim were hybrids, neither fully divine nor fully human, endowed with extraordinary strength, intelligence, and influence. This idea, while unsettling, aligns with other ancient texts outside the Bible that describe celestial beings interacting with humanity in destructive ways. Another interpretation takes a more human-centered approach, arguing that the sons of God were powerful rulers or elite lineages who claimed divine authority. In this view, the Nephilim were not supernatural giants but ruthless warriors, tyrants, or kings who dominated early societies through violence and fear. Their reputation as men of renown may reflect fame earned through conquest rather than physical size. Supporters of this explanation argue that it fits within known patterns of ancient propaganda, where rulers exaggerated their power and origins to legitimize control. Despite these differing views, what remains consistent is the tone of warning embedded in the text. The Nephilim are not presented as a blessing, but as part of a troubling development that accelerates humanity's downfall. The narrative quickly moves toward divine regret over the state of the world, suggesting that whatever the Nephilim represented, whether literal giants or symbolic embodiments of corruption, their influence was deeply negative. This connection strengthens the argument that their existence marked a turning point, a moment when boundaries were crossed and consequences became unavoidable. The mystery deepens when similar stories appear in cultures far removed from ancient Israel. Legends of giants surface in Mesopotamian records, early Greek mythology, and even in distant regions with no known contact at the time. These accounts often describe beings of immense strength who ruled over humans, demanded worship, or brought destruction before being wiped out by divine or natural catastrophe. For some researchers, this pattern suggests a shared memory of extraordinary figures preserved through different traditions. For others, it reflects a universal human tendency to explain chaos and suffering through larger-than-life characters. What makes the Nephilim story particularly unsettling is its brevity. The Bible offers no physical descriptions, no names, and no detailed accounts of their actions. This silence has allowed speculation to flourish, but it also suggests that the original audience may have already understood the reference. If so, the Nephilim were not obscure myths, but widely known figures whose reputation needed no explanation. That possibility challenges modern readers, raising the question of how much ancient knowledge has been lost over time. As a result, part one of this story is not about answers, but about the shock of the claim itself. The Bible introduces the Nephilim quietly, yet the implications are explosive. Whether viewed as literal giants, supernatural hybrids, or powerful human figures, their appearance signals that something went profoundly wrong in the ancient world. That unresolved tension sets the stage for deeper investigation, leaving behind a haunting impression that history may hold darker secrets than it is willing to reveal. As scholars and researchers turned their attention more closely to the Nephilim, the discussion moved beyond theology into history, linguistics, and archaeology. The original Hebrew word, Nephilim, itself became a central point of debate. Derived from a root that can mean to fall, some experts argue the term suggests fallen ones, reinforcing the idea of a connection to fallen angels or beings that descended from a higher realm. Others maintain that the word simply describes those who caused others to fall, implying violent warriors or oppressors who brought destruction wherever they went. This linguistic uncertainty has ensured that no single interpretation has ever achieved universal acceptance. Ancient Jewish writings outside the Bible, particularly texts from the Second Temple period, added fuel to the controversy. Works such as the Book of Enoch describe in detail how angelic beings descended to earth, took human wives, and produced giant offspring who consumed resources, dominated humanity, and plunged the world into chaos. While these writings are not part of the biblical canon for most traditions, they were widely read in ancient times and influenced early interpretations of Genesis. For many scholars, these texts suggest that early readers understood the Nephilim story in a far more literal and supernatural way than later interpretations allow. At the same time, historians have pointed out that ancient cultures often used exaggerated language to describe powerful figures. Kings were portrayed as larger than life, sometimes even divine, to inspire fear and loyalty. From this perspective, the Nephilim could represent a class of elite warriors or rulers whose power was so overwhelming that later generations remembered them as giants. Their fame as men of renown may reflect legendary status rather than physical stature. This explanation appeals to researchers who prefer interpretations grounded in known social and political patterns of the ancient world. The controversy intensified with claims of archaeological discoveries allegedly supporting the existence of giants. Over the past 2 centuries, reports have surfaced of unusually large skeletons found in different parts of the world. Some newspapers in the 19th and early 20th centuries published sensational stories describing massive human remains uncovered during excavations. However, most of these claims have been challenged or debunked, often traced back to misidentified animal bones, exaggerated measurements, or outright hoaxes. Mainstream archaeology has found no verified evidence of a race of giants matching the biblical descriptions, yet the persistence of these reports continues to intrigue the public. Cross-cultural comparisons further complicate the picture. Stories of giants appear in Mesopotamian epics, such as the tale of Gilgamesh, who himself is described as larger and stronger than ordinary men. Greek mythology speaks of the Titans, beings of immense power who ruled before being overthrown. Similar legends exist in Celtic, Norse, and even indigenous traditions across the Americas. The widespread nature of these stories raises a difficult question. Are they independent myths created to explain natural disasters and social upheaval, or do they preserve fragments of a shared ancient memory? Modern scholars remain divided largely because the biblical text itself offers so little detail. Genesis does not explain how tall the Nephilim were, what they looked like, or exactly what they did. This lack of information forces researchers to rely on interpretation rather than direct evidence. Some theologians argue that the ambiguity is intentional, emphasizing the moral lesson rather than the physical details. In this view, the Nephilim narrative serves as a warning about the dangers of power without restraint and the consequences of violating divine boundaries. Skeptics, on the other hand, caution against reading later ideas back into the text. They argue that supernatural interpretations often reflect cultural fears rather than historical reality. From this angle, the Nephilim story may have been a way for ancient writers to explain why their world seemed so violent and unjust, attributing blame to a corrupted past filled with monstrous figures. This approach treats the account as theological storytelling rather than literal history. Despite decades of study, Part 2 of the Nephilim story remains defined by disagreement rather than consensus. Every interpretation, whether supernatural, symbolic, or historical, encounters unanswered questions and unresolved tensions. What is clear is that the Nephilim narrative refuses to be dismissed easily. Its presence in one of the most influential texts in human history ensures that it will continue to challenge scholars, believers, and skeptics alike, standing as one of the Bible's most controversial and debated mysteries. The final and darkest dimension of the Nephilim story emerges when the narrative turns toward judgment and aftermath. According to the biblical account, the period in which the Nephilim existed was marked by unprecedented corruption and violence. Human society is described as being so morally degraded that every inclination of the heart was continually evil. In this setting, the Nephilim are not isolated figures but part of a broader collapse that affects the entire world. Their presence appears to symbolize, or possibly accelerate, a point of no return, after which restoration is no longer possible without dramatic intervention. The text quickly moves from the mention of the Nephilim to one of the most severe actions attributed to God in Scripture, the decision to wipe out almost all life through the Great Flood. This connection has led many interpreters to conclude that the Nephilim were more than a background detail. Whether understood as literal beings or as representations of unchecked power, they stand at the center of a world that has crossed dangerous boundaries. The flood, in this sense, is portrayed not merely as punishment, but as a reset, an attempt to cleanse creation from a corruption that had become irreversible. What makes this outcome particularly unsettling is that the Nephilim themselves disappear almost as suddenly as they appear. There is no detailed account of their destruction, no description of their final days, and no explanation of their fate beyond the flood narrative. This silence has encouraged speculation that their influence extended beyond their physical existence. Some traditions suggest that while their bodies were destroyed, their legacy of violence and rebellion continued to shape human history. Others see their disappearance as intentional, reinforcing the idea that certain knowledge or events were not meant to be preserved in detail. The lasting impact of the Nephilim story lies largely in its warning. Across centuries, theologians have interpreted it as a lesson about the dangers of transgressing established limits. Whether those limits are understood as divine laws, moral boundaries, or social constraints, the message remains consistent. When power is abused and order is corrupted, consequences follow. The Nephilim become a symbol of what happens when strength is divorced from responsibility and ambition overrides restraint. In later biblical texts, echoes of the giant tradition resurface, particularly in stories involving unusually large warriors encountered by the Israelites. Figures such as the Anak and Goliath are described using language that recalls the Nephilim, reviving the fear and awe associated with giants. While these later accounts are more concrete and grounded in historical narratives, they suggest that the memory of the Nephilim lingered in the collective consciousness. Giants, whether real or symbolic, continued to represent overwhelming threats that ordinary people could not face without divine assistance. Over time, the Nephilim narrative has taken on a broader cultural role. In literature, film, and popular media, it has been reimagined as evidence of hidden histories, ancient conspiracies, or suppressed truths. For some audiences, the story feeds into the belief that humanity's past is far stranger than conventional history admits. For others, it functions as a metaphor, reflecting recurring patterns of rise, corruption, and collapse that repeat throughout civilizations. This adaptability has allowed the Nephilim to remain relevant, even as interpretations shift with changing worldviews. Critically, the enduring mystery of the Nephilim challenges readers to confront uncertainty. The Bible does not provide clear answers about who they truly were, and modern research has not closed the gap. Instead, the story invites reflection on how myths, history, and belief intersect. It raises questions about how ancient people understood evil, power, and responsibility, and how those understandings were encoded into narratives that could endure for millennia. In the end, the dark secret of the Nephilim may not be a hidden race of giants or a lost chapter of human history, but the uncomfortable truth the story exposes about humanity itself. The narrative suggests that corruption does not emerge suddenly, it grows when boundaries are ignored and power goes unchecked. The Nephilim stand as a reminder that civilizations can reach a point where destruction becomes the only path to renewal. Whether read as literal history or symbolic warning, the story leaves a lasting impression, urging each generation to consider how close it may be to repeating the same ancient mistakes.